Here are my tips for growing great homegrown tomatoes. It's a warm one here today, and the sun's out, which is nice because it's been raining here. But the warmth means that all the plants are starting to go pop. And for many of you, particularly in the southern states, now is the time to be planting tomatoes. When is the time to start planting your tomatoes? Well, it's got nothing to do necessarily with the air temperature, but all to do with the soil temperature. The old school way of figuring that out was to actually sit on the ground, and if you got a cold bum, it wasn't time for the tomatoes to be planted. If it was warm, it was ready. However, you can purchase a soil thermometer, and I've got one here, soil thermometer from your local nursery, and ideally you want to aim for something around 18 degrees Celsius. I've got a nitrogen fixing crop in it, being beans, and in most cases you're going to grow those over the winter months. So you're going to grow things like broad beans or peas in the place where you're going to be planting your tomatoes. I also then like to top dress with some compost and some organic fertiliser. I use a pelletized form, which is basically essentially just chicken manure and some seaweed solution. However, you could use blood and bone. The only thing with blood and bone, typically quite often, it doesn't have potassium, so potash in it, so you're going to need to add that too. I like to feed my garden beds first prior to planting. I won't feed throughout the season. What I will do is I'll just top up with some soil conditioner, so some worm castings and some seaweed solution. And the reason being is that I don't want to overfeed my tomatoes, because overfeeding them results in actually producing lots of foliage. So if it's nitrogen rich, you get lots of foliage and hardly any fruit. A plant will only want to reproduce itself when it's slightly stressed, so you don't want to give it too much comfort. So if you give it too much fertilizer, all it does is just produces a lot of foliage. The next step is planting them and choosing a variety. The two main ones are determinate and indeterminate. Now, determinate refers to bush tomatoes. Now they stay really small. And then you have indeterminate, which are staking varieties. Now, in terms of most tomatoes available to you, particularly in your local nursery, most of them typically are indeterminate and they're staking tomatoes. Bush tomatoes, on the other hand, determinate ones, are great for pots. And in terms of varieties, particularly if you're starting out, I always like to go with a cherry tomato. You're going to get lots of fruit, and also they tend to be more disease resistant and hardier. With an heirloom tomato, it's open pollinated, means that you can save the seed and actually plant them next year and they will have the same offspring. Where with hybrids, where they actually cross breed two varieties, if you plant the seeds of that hybrid, it's going to revert back to one of the parents. So you've got things like F1 and F2, and that's just in reference to the crossbreeding. I would typically start seeds inside in winter, but one of the great things about tomatoes is that there is a great variety available to you at your local nurseries. Now, in terms of staking, I like to stake my tomatoes before planting. This helps me actually gauge my spacing, but also means that I'm not going to do any damage to the plant's roots. So I stake mine first. I like using hardwood stakes, but you could have different growing mechanisms. I've also used it before where I've used string overhanging, where I've created a frame, but stakes work well. And also I like to tie my tomatoes up. So I tie to the stake first, and then I tie to the plant. So then that way I'm not actually restricting the growth of the plant. Pinching out and pruning your tomatoes. With cherry tomatoes I don't bother because I want lots of fruit, but with staking tomatoes I'm going to want to pinch them out, and pinch them out I mean by prune them, and that means actually concentrating the energy into the fruit itself rather than into the foliage. Essentially what I'm doing is just removing any side growth up until the first flower. The watering, that's the other quintessential thing that you need to get right with tomatoes. More often than not, most people get watering wrong because they're inconsistent. That's where you get scarring and also issues with splitting. I like to water particularly in the morning, and the reason being is that it allows the plant to dry out throughout the day. And my final tip is around harvesting. Now, towards the end of the season, potentially some of your tomatoes won't ripen on the vine. They'll stay green, and one of the ways to encourage them to ripen is to grab a knife and actually cut the roots of the plant to encourage those tomatoes to actually start to ripen. If, however, that doesn't work, you can always harvest them green, put them on the windowsill, and they will start to ripen. Worst case scenarios is that you can actually make a green tomato pickle, and I've got a great recipe in an earlier video. Tomato plants smell amazing, and to me it's one of the smells of summer, and nothing tastes better than a tomato that you've picked from the vine and eaten in your own garden. How good is that? Anyway, if you want to find out more tips and tricks, please subscribe and like this channel. Also, go and visit my website, thehungrygardener.com.au, where you can actually enroll into the Veggie Patch School. Please leave comments on anything that you'd like to know more about, or any experiences that you've had in growing tomatoes yourself. So thank you for watching, and remember, stay hungry.